The first thing Ethan Brooks thought when the doctor said congratulations was that Mason Whitaker would leave before the baby was even born. The room was too bright. All white walls and soft gray cabinets and a paper-covered exam table that crinkled under Ethan every time he breathed. Somewhere behind the closed door, a nurse laughed gently at something in the hallway, normal and warm and impossible, while Ethan stared at the small ultrasound photo in his trembling hands like it had fallen out of another life. He was 26, an Omega who still looked younger than he felt, with soft brown hair falling into his eyes and a sweater sleeve pulled halfway over his palm because he had forgotten how hands were supposed to behave. Dr. Miller smiled at him from her rolling chair, kind in that careful way people were kind right before your whole world changed shape. "You are about 8 weeks along," she said, "and the baby looks healthy so far." Healthy. The word landed in his chest like a tiny light turning on in a dark house. Ethan pressed his fingers to his lower stomach, not because there was anything to feel yet, not really, but because he needed proof that this was happening inside him and not just on a screen. For one ridiculous second, happiness rose so fast it almost hurt. He imagined Mason standing in their kitchen, sleeves rolled up, black hair still damp from his morning shower, looking at the ultrasound with that quiet, unreadable alpha expression of his. Mason would freeze first, of course. He always froze when emotions got too big. Then he would ask if Ethan was okay. Then maybe, just maybe, he would touch Ethan's waist with those careful hands and say they would figure it out together. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then memory slid in, sharp and cold. Mason at a charity dinner 3 months ago, holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to some board member joke about settling down. Mason's voice had been calm when he answered, too calm. "Kids are not for me. I would be terrible at it. Honestly, I do not even like being around them." Everyone had laughed like it was just another polished, charming line from a man too important to be bothered by tiny shoes and sticky fingers and bedtime stories. Ethan had laughed too, because that was what you did when you were the not-quite boyfriend standing beside a man who never corrected anyone when they called you his friend. But the sentence had stayed. It had tucked itself under Ethan's ribs and waited there, patient as a bruise. Now, sitting in a clinic less than 2 miles from the apartment they shared but never called home, Ethan looked down at the little blur on the ultrasound and whispered, so softly Dr. Miller did not hear, "Your alpha does not want kids." The baby did not answer. The room did not change. Outside, afternoon traffic moved along the street like nothing sacred had just begun. Dr. Miller handed him a folder with prenatal vitamins, appointment dates, and pamphlets about Omega pregnancy care. Ethan nodded at all the right moments, thanked her with a voice that sounded borrowed, and tucked the ultrasound into his coat pocket like a secret too fragile for daylight. 6 hours earlier, he had woken up believing this might become the happiest day of his life. Mason had been in the kitchen making tea because he knew coffee made Ethan's stomach twist lately. He had not asked why. Mason noticed everything and named nothing. That was his talent. That was his crime. Ethan had stood barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, watching him move through the morning light, and thought, "I love you so much it has made me stupid." Mason glanced over his shoulder and raised one eyebrow. "You were staring." Ethan had pulled his sleeves over his hands and smiled. "You make tea like you are negotiating a hostage release." Mason gave a quiet huff, almost a laugh, and Ethan had stored it away like a jewel. Now, outside the clinic, with the folder pressed to his chest and winter wind slipping under his collar, that memory felt like something from a movie where the ending had already been spoiled. His phone buzzed. "Mason, dinner with my mother tonight. 6 sharp. Please do not be late." Ethan stared at the message until the words blurred. His other hand drifted to his pocket, where the first picture of their child rested against his palm. He should have told him right then. He should have typed, "Mason, I need to talk to you." Instead, Ethan swallowed the fear rising in his throat, looked up at the pale Denver sky, and typed back, "I will be there." Ethan reached Mason's penthouse at 5:57, because being early felt desperate and being late felt like asking for judgment in formal wear. The building lobby smelled like polished stone, winter coats, and money that had never once worried about rent. He stood in the elevator with one hand around the thin paper bag from a baby boutique 3 blocks from the clinic, his thumb rubbing the folded edge until it softened. Inside were the tiny cream-colored socks he had bought on impulse, impossibly small, absurdly cute, the kind of thing that made his chest ache with a joy he did not trust. He had almost left them at the store. Then the cashier, a grandmotherly woman with silver curls and red glasses, had smiled and said, "First baby?" Ethan had frozen so completely she looked worried. He had nodded once, and she had placed the socks in tissue paper like she was wrapping a star. Now that star felt heavy enough to pull him through the elevator floor. When the doors opened, Mason was waiting in the entryway, dressed in a charcoal suit with no tie, his black hair neat, his expression calm in that expensive way that made strangers obey before they understood why. His blue eyes moved over Ethan's face. "You look pale," he said. Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because Mason could notice the shade of his skin changing and still not ask the question underneath it. "I am fine," Ethan said, which was the official language of people absolutely not fine. Mason stepped closer, and for one breath Ethan thought he might touch his cheek. Instead, Mason took the paper bag from his hand, frowning slightly. "What is this?" Ethan snatched it back too quickly. "Nothing. A gift. For later." Mason studied him, unreadable. Before he could ask more, the private dining room doors opened, and Evelyn Whitaker's voice floated out, smooth as cold butter. "Mason, darling, do not keep me waiting." Ethan had met Mason's mother 12 times in 3 years, and every time she looked at him like she was trying to remember whether he came with the furniture. Evelyn was beautiful in a sharp, wintry way, pale blonde hair pinned perfectly, pearl earrings glowing at her neck, smile arranged with surgical precision. "Ethan," she said, offering him her cheek without leaning close enough for an actual greeting. "How nice. Still living in Denver?" Ethan blinked once. "Yes. With Mason." Evelyn's smile did not move. Of course. Dinner was served by a quiet housekeeper who placed roasted chicken, asparagus, and small golden potatoes on white plates while Ethan sat across from Mason and tried not to think about the ultrasound folded inside his coat pocket. Mason poured him sparkling water without asking, because he remembered Ethan did not drink wine. That small kindness nearly ruined him. For 3 years, Mason had built a home out of details and refused to put a name on it. He knew Ethan slept better on the left side of the bed. He knew Ethan hated cilantro. He knew Ethan watched old holiday movies when he was anxious. He knew everything except how badly Ethan wanted to belong. Evelyn talked about a hospital fundraiser, a senator's daughter getting engaged, a cousin buying a house in Aspen. Then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, she turned to Mason with the smile of a woman setting a trap with clean hands. "I saw Caleb and his husband last week," she said. "Their little girl is darling. Nearly 2 now." Mason's fork paused. Evelyn continued, light and poisonous. "It made me wonder whether you have given any thought to children." Ethan felt every sound in the room step backward. Mason set his fork down. "No," he said. "Just like that. One word. Clean. Final." Evelyn sighed. "Mason, you are 32. You cannot avoid legacy forever." Mason's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I am not avoiding anything. I do not want children." Ethan's fingers curled around the napkin in his lap. The paper bag rested beside his chair, hidden in shadow. Evelyn glanced toward Ethan for half a second, then back at her son. "Is that your decision, or his influence?" Mason's eyes sharpened. "Leave Ethan out of it." A foolish hope sparked in Ethan's chest. Then Mason crushed it without looking at him. "Kids are not part of my life. Mother, I would be terrible at it. I do not have the patience, and I do not have the interest. Everyone acts like children are some magical blessing, but to me they are noise, responsibility, and a life sentence people dress up in pastel blankets." The room went silent. Ethan did not move. He did not breathe right. He only heard the soft, imaginary sound of tiny cream-colored socks slipping from tissue paper somewhere deep inside his heart. Ethan learned something strange about heartbreak at that dinner table. It did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sat politely between dessert plates and coffee cups, wearing a pressed charcoal suit and speaking in a voice calm enough to pass for reason. Mason did not shout. He did not sneer. He did not even look cruel. He simply folded his napkin beside his plate and made the future disappear in one clean sentence. Ethan kept his face still because his body had forgotten every other option. Across from him, Evelyn watched with the delicate satisfaction of someone who had not spilled anything on her white tablecloth, not even blood, not even truth. Mason reached for his water glass, and the movement pulled Ethan back into the room with an awful little snap. "Are you all right?" Mason asked. There it was again, that careful attention. The same man who had just called children a life sentence noticed the tremor in Ethan's fingers. The unfairness of it almost made Ethan laugh. "I am fine," he said, and this time the lie tasted like metal. Evelyn tilted her head. "You do look pale. Perhaps the chicken was too rich for you." Ethan stood so quickly his chair gave a soft scrape against the floor. "Excuse me," he said. "Bathroom." One word. Not elegant. Not convincing. Just survival. He made it down the hallway without running, which felt like an achievement worth an award no one should ever want. The guest bathroom was marble and gold and cold enough to make him feel like a misplaced houseplant. Ethan locked the door, set the baby boutique bag on the counter, and finally let his smile fall off his face. His reflection stared back at him. Too pale, green-gray eyes too wide, one hand pressed to his stomach as if he could cover the tiny life. Inside him from a sentence Mason had already thrown into the world. He pulled the ultrasound from his coat pocket with shaking fingers. The image was mostly blur and shadow, a little secret shaped like a question. Then he opened the bag. The cream-colored socks rested inside the tissue paper, soft and ridiculous, each one smaller than Ethan's thumb from knuckle to tip. He had imagined Mason holding them. He had imagined confusion first, then fear, then maybe wonder. He had imagined the kind of silence that became an embrace. Instead, he stood alone under a bathroom light worth more than his first car and understood that hope could be embarrassing. A quiet knock touched the door. "Ethan." Mason's voice. Low. Controlled. Too close. Ethan folded the ultrasound fast, shoved it into his inner coat pocket, and wiped under his eyes even though no tears had fallen yet. "Yes? Are you sick?" For one wild second, Ethan almost opened the door. He almost said, "Yes, Mason, I am sick with something that sounds like love and looks like a baby. I am scared. I need you to be better than the version of yourself you keep offering me." But Mason had already answered the question Ethan had not asked. So Ethan looked at the tiny socks one last time, tucked them back into the bag, and said, "I just need a minute." A pause followed. Not empty. Mason was still there. Ethan could feel him on the other side of the door, solid and uncertain. An alpha trained to fix business problems, broken contracts, bad headlines. Anything except the heart of the Omega who had been standing beside him for 3 years waiting to be chosen. "All right," Mason said at last. "I will be outside." His footsteps moved away. Ethan closed his eyes. That was Mason. Always outside. Outside the door. Outside the promise. Outside the future Ethan had been foolish enough to picture. When he returned to the dining room, he smiled, apologized, and survived the rest of dinner one careful breath at a time. He did not mention the clinic. He did not give Mason the bag. He did not let his hand drift to his stomach again. But under the table, hidden by the white linen cloth, Ethan made his first decision as a parent. If Mason Whitaker did not want this child, then Mason Whitaker would never have to know. By the time Mason drove them back to the penthouse, snow had begun to fall over Denver in thin, restless pieces, not enough to cover the streets, just enough to make every window look like it was trying not to cry. Ethan sat in the passenger seat with the baby boutique bag on his lap and his coat buttoned all the way to his throat. Mason kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other near the gearshift, close enough that Ethan could have reached for him if he still believed touching fixed anything. For 10 silent minutes, the city passed in silver streaks outside the glass. Mason glanced at him twice. The third time, he finally said, "My mother was rude tonight." Ethan looked at the blurred lights ahead. "She usually is." Mason exhaled through his nose, almost amused, almost tired. "I should have stopped her sooner." Ethan wanted to say, "You were not the part that hurt because you stopped her. You were the part that hurt because you agreed with her after." Instead, he said, "It is fine." Mason's jaw tightened. "You keep saying that." Ethan turned his face toward the window before his expression betrayed him. "Maybe I am practicing." Mason did not answer, and somehow that was worse than if he had argued. At the penthouse, everything looked exactly the same, which felt deeply offensive. The entryway lights glowed warm over polished floors. Mason's black coat hung beside Ethan's beige one. 2 mugs waited in the sink from that morning, one with a faint line of honey tea at the bottom. Their life was still standing there, neat and beautiful, like it had not hurt itself ending. Mason went to his office to take a call from Chicago, voice low behind the glass door, all numbers and schedules, and controlled authority. Ethan stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening. Then he moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, quietly. He took the small overnight suitcase from the closet and placed it on the bed. The sound of the zipper opening seemed enormous. He packed 3 sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, socks, underwear, his sketchbook, prenatal vitamins, and the ultrasound photo wrapped inside a folded scarf. He left behind the expensive watch Mason had bought him last Christmas because it suddenly felt like evidence from a trial he did not want to attend. He left the framed photo from their trip to Boulder, too. In it, Mason was looking at Ethan instead of the camera. Ethan turned the frame face down. That almost broke him. Almost. In the bathroom, he stared at their toothbrushes standing side by side in a ceramic cup. Blue for Mason. White for Ethan. Such a stupid, domestic little detail. Such a cruel thing. How love could shrink into objects when the people inside it failed to speak. Ethan took his toothbrush. Then, after a hesitation that made his throat ache, he took Mason's old gray sweatshirt from the laundry basket and pressed it to his chest once before folding it into the suitcase. Not because he forgave him. Not because he was weak. Because the baby might one day ask what his alpha smelled like, and Ethan hated himself for needing an answer. On the kitchen counter, he wrote the note 3 times before the words stopped shaking. The first version was too angry. The second was too honest. The third was short enough to survive. Mason, I am sorry for wanting more than you could give me. Please do not look for me. Ethan. He placed his key beside it. Then he set the baby boutique bag on the entry table, stared at it, and changed his mind. No, Mason did not get that part of the story. Not yet. Ethan tucked the tiny socks into his suitcase with the ultrasound and closed it softly. When Mason came out of his office 20 minutes later, the apartment was quiet in a way he did not understand. The bedroom door was open. The closet light was on. Ethan's coat was gone. On the counter, under the warm kitchen light, the key waited beside 5 lines of handwriting. Mason picked up the note, read it once, and went very still. Outside, the elevator doors had already closed. Mason read the note 3 times before the words became shapes instead of meaning. I am sorry for wanting more than you could give me. Please do not look for me. 5 lines. That was all Ethan had left after 3 years of mornings, half-finished movies, shared grocery lists, quiet laughter over burnt pancakes, and Mason pretending he did not notice how Ethan looked at him whenever someone mentioned forever. The penthouse seemed to expand around him, every wall moving farther away. Mason set the note down, then picked it up again because his hand did not know how to be empty. Ethan had taken his coat, his toothbrush, the worn brown boots he wore when snow turned the sidewalks ugly. In the bedroom, Mason opened the closet and stared at the blank space where Ethan's sweaters used to hang in a soft, uneven row. Ethan organized by color until he got bored halfway through. Cream, beige, pale blue, then complete chaos. Mason had once teased him for it. Ethan had stuck his tongue out and said, "You are lucky I am charming." Mason had said nothing back because the words I know had felt too dangerous. Now the silence answered for him. He moved through the apartment like a man searching a museum after the exhibit had been removed. The living room still held Ethan's blue throw blanket folded over the couch. His favorite mug sat in the sink, a tiny chip near the handle. A lemon-scented candle stood on the coffee table, burned down unevenly because Ethan always forgot to trim the wick. Mason touched none of it at first. Touching made it real. Not touching made it worse. His phone was in his hand before he remembered picking it up. He called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Same soft recorded voice. "Hi, this is Ethan. Leave a message, unless you are trying to sell me car insurance, in which case, emotionally, I am not home." Mason closed his eyes. That stupid message. That warm, ridiculous voice. He sent one text. "Where are you?" Then another. "Ethan, answer me." Then a third, slower. "Please." The word looked wrong coming from him. Too small. Too late. An hour passed. Then 2. The snow thickened beyond the windows, turning Denver into a blurred white grid below. Mason called Ethan's best friend, Nora Alvarez, a photographer with pink hair, a terrifying laugh, and no patience for emotionally unavailable alphas. She answered on the 5th ring. "Mason Whitaker," she said flatly. "This better be an apology with interest." Mason stood by the kitchen island, Ethan's note. Under his palm. Is Ethan with you? Silence. Then Nora's voice sharpened. What did you do? I did not do anything. The lie came out automatically, polished by years of boardrooms and family dinners. Then he looked at the empty place beside the sink where Ethan's toothbrush had been and felt the lie collapse inside him. I said something, Mason corrected, quieter. Something unforgivable. Nora exhaled, and in that breath Mason heard confirmation. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. He is safe, she said. That is all you get from me. Where is he? No. Nora. No, Mason. You do not get to misplace a person for 3 years and then act shocked when he finally stops waiting in the place you left him. The call ended. Mason stood frozen, phone still against his ear. Safe. Ethan was safe. The word should have helped. It did not. Across the city, at a bus station glowing under harsh fluorescent lights, Ethan sat with his suitcase between his knees and Mason's gray sweatshirt folded in his lap. The ticket in his pocket said Silver Harbor, Oregon. 1,246 miles. 27 hours by bus. Far enough to breathe. Far enough to become someone Mason could not accidentally hurt. When the boarding call echoed overhead, Ethan stood, placed one hand over his stomach, and whispered, "We are going to be okay." Then he stepped forward before his courage could turn around. 7 weeks later, Silver Harbor smelled like rain, sea salt, and cinnamon bread from the bakery below Ethan's rented room. It was not a pretty town in the perfect postcard way. The sidewalks cracked near the curb, the beach was more gray stone than golden sand, and half the storefronts had hand-painted signs because nobody had the money to replace anything unless it fully stopped working. But every morning, fog rolled in from the Oregon coast like a soft blanket, and for the first time in years, Ethan could wake up without checking whether Mason had already emotionally left the room before his body did. He lived above a bakery called June's Hearth, owned by a round-faced beta woman named June Mercer, who wore flour on her cheek like a permanent accessory and treated privacy like a sacred religion. She had asked Ethan exactly 3 questions when he applied for the room and part-time counter job. Can you lift 20 pounds? Do you know how to make change? Are you running from danger or just heartbreak? Ethan had stared at her. June had shrugged. Different policies for different answers, sweetheart. He had told her the truth, or the smallest safe piece of it. Heartbreak. June handed him an apron and said, "Then we start with muffins." Now Ethan spent his mornings boxing blueberry scones, wiping tables, and learning which regulars wanted oat milk, which wanted gossip, and which wanted to pretend they were not lonely. His body changed quietly under loose sweaters. Some mornings he felt strong enough to reorganize the display case by color just because it pleased him. Other mornings he stood behind the counter with one hand low on his stomach, breathing through waves of dizziness while June pretended not to notice and slid crackers beside the register. The baby was still tiny, but already impossible to ignore. A secret with a heartbeat. A future with no last name, Ethan dared to say aloud. At night, he sat by the window in Mason's gray sweatshirt, listening to rain tap the glass, and hated how comfort could still smell like the person who hurt you. Back in Denver, Mason had become a rumor in his own life. His employees whispered that he no longer took lunch. Evelyn called twice a day until he blocked her for one blessed weekend. The penthouse stayed immaculate because no one was there to make it human. No blue blanket on the couch. No honey tea cooling in the mug. No soft voice complaining that rich people refrigerators made ice like they were judging you. Mason hired a private investigator on the 8th day, fired him on the 9th when the man suggested Ethan might not want to be found, then hired him again with stricter instructions and a much larger check. Still, there was nothing. Ethan had closed every door with terrifying gentleness. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Mason's assistant brought in a small stack of mail that had been misdirected to the old building management office. Most of it was junk. One envelope was from a women's and Omega Health clinic 2 miles from the penthouse. Mason stood at his desk for a full minute before opening it. Inside was a reminder for Ethan Brooks regarding a prenatal follow-up appointment he had missed. Prenatal. The word did not shout. It did not need to. Mason sat down slowly, the paper trembling once between his fingers. Suddenly, the pale face at dinner, the hidden bag, the way Ethan had held his stomach in the hallway, all rearranged themselves into a truth so bright it hurt to look at. Mason whispered Ethan's name like a prayer arriving too late. And for the first time in his life, the silence did not obey him. Mason did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen island with the clinic letter flattened under both palms, reading the same word until it stopped looking like English and started looking like judgment. Prenatal. Ethan had been pregnant at dinner. Ethan had been pregnant when Mason said children were noise and responsibility and a life sentence in pastel blankets. Ethan had been pregnant when he stood in that marble bathroom, probably holding that truth alone while Mason waited outside the door like a coward with expensive shoes. The memory came back with cruel precision. The paper bag, Ethan snatching it back, his pale mouth, his hand drifting once, almost unconsciously, toward his stomach. Mason stood so fast the chair scraped across the floor. For once, the sound did not make him flinch. He went to the entry table, the bedroom, the closet, the bathroom drawers, searching not for proof now, but punishment. He found none. Ethan had taken every trace that mattered. Then, behind a stack of folded winter scarves on the top shelf, Mason found a small receipt from a baby boutique on Pearl Street. 2 items. Cream newborn socks. Gift tissue. Purchased at 3:17 in the afternoon, the same day Ethan left. Mason held the receipt like it could burn him. The socks had been real. The hope had been real. He sank onto the edge of the bed Ethan no longer slept in and finally understood that Ethan had not disappeared because he wanted too much. Ethan had disappeared because Mason had made wanting anything feel unsafe. Morning found him in his parked car, outside Nora Alvarez's studio, looking like a man who had misplaced his entire soul and tried to replace it with black coffee. Nora opened the door before he knocked twice. No, she said. Mason swallowed. He is pregnant. Nora's expression changed before she could stop it. One small fracture. Enough. Mason's voice went rough. I did not know. Nora crossed her arms. That does not make it better. I know. Do you? Because Ethan knew. He knew exactly what you thought about families because you made sure everyone in that dining room heard it. Mason looked down at the wet sidewalk. I was not talking about him. I was talking about myself. Nora did not soften. That is the problem with people like you. You throw knives at yourself and act surprised when someone standing close starts bleeding. Mason closed his eyes. I need to find him. You need to leave him alone. I need to know he is safe. Nora stared at him for a long time, then stepped outside and pulled the studio door shut behind her. The winter air turned her breath white. He is safe, she said. He is also scared, tired, and trying to build a life without wondering whether the person he loves will reject his child. Our child, Mason whispered. Nora's face sharpened. Do not say that like ownership. Say it like responsibility. The words landed exactly where they needed to. Mason nodded once, almost painfully. Responsibility, he repeated. Across the country, Ethan was learning to write his new address without shaking. Silver Harbor, Oregon. Apartment 2 over June's Hearth Bakery. He wrote it on a clinic form while the local nurse measured his blood pressure and told him the baby had a strong heartbeat. Strong. Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. For the rest of the day, he carried that word around like a match cupped safely against the wind. In Denver, Mason opened a locked drawer in his office and removed a photograph he had not looked at in years. He was 7 in it, standing stiff beside his father at a company picnic, small hands clenched, face trained not to need anything. His father had called children distractions, weakness, mistakes that learned to speak. Mason had spent his whole life becoming silent enough to be acceptable. Then he had used that silence to hurt the only person who had ever made home feel possible. He placed Ethan's note, the clinic letter, and the tiny receipt side by side on his desk. Not evidence. A map of everything he had broken. When the private investigator called 2 days later and said a bus ticket under Ethan's name had been traced to the Oregon coast, Mason did not feel triumph. He felt fear, clean and humbling. He booked the next flight to Portland with one promise repeating in his head. He would not drag Ethan home. He would not demand forgiveness. He would only ask where he was allowed to stand. Mason reached Silver Harbor at 4:12 in the afternoon, after one flight, one rental car, and 3 hours of coastal roads that curved between dark pine trees and cliffs wrapped in fog. Oregon rain did not fall the way Denver snow did. It stayed everywhere, soft and patient, silvering the windshield, blurring the ocean, turning the whole town into something half-remembered. Mason parked across from June's Hearth Bakery with both hands still gripping the steering wheel long after the engine went quiet. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a warm yellow light, a chalkboard sign advertising cinnamon rolls, and a row of paper snowflakes taped crookedly to the glass. It was the kind of place Ethan would have loved immediately and pretended not to love too much. Mason sat there, unable to move, because somewhere inside that small bakery was the life he had broken, and for once money, power, and his last name had no use at all. A bell chimed when the door opened. An elderly man stepped out with a box tied in twine. Behind him, just for a second, Mason saw a slim figure in a cream sweater reach across the counter with a paper bag, brown hair falling softly over his forehead. A gentle smile that did not quite reach his tired eyes. Ethan. Mason forgot how to breathe. He did not rush in. Every instinct in him pulled forward, but Nora's voice cut through memory like a hand on his shoulder. Do not say that like ownership. Say it like responsibility. So Mason stayed outside in the rain and watched Ethan laugh quietly at something the old man said. It was not a bright laugh. It was thinner than before, careful around the edges, but it was real enough to make Mason ache. Ethan looked different. Softer in some places, more guarded in others. One hand rested near his stomach when he turned, not dramatically, not for attention, just naturally, like his body had learned where to protect its smallest secret. Mason's throat tightened so sharply he had to look away. He had imagined this moment 100 times on the drive. Ethan would yell. Ethan would cry. Ethan would refuse to see him. He had prepared for anger because anger was a door, even if it slammed. What he had not prepared for was Ethan looking peaceful without him. The bell chimed again, and this time a woman with flour on her cheek stepped out carrying a trash bag. She stopped under the awning and looked directly at Mason through the rain, as if she had known he was there before he did. June Mercer, he guessed. She studied his expensive coat, his rental car, his face, then said, "If you are here to ruin his day, I have a rolling pin and no witnesses worth trusting." Mason blinked. In another life, Ethan would have laughed until he could not stand. "I deserve that," Mason said. June's eyes narrowed. "Most men say they do not. I am not here to take him anywhere." "Good, because he is not luggage." "I know. Do you?" Mason looked through the window again. Ethan was arranging muffins in the display case, lips moving as if he was counting under his breath. "I know I hurt him," Mason said. "I know knowing why does not erase what I said. I know he owes me nothing." June was quiet for a long moment. Rain tapped against the awning between them. Finally, she sighed. "He has a doctor appointment tomorrow morning at 10. He walks there because he says the fresh air helps, even when the fresh air is basically soup." Mason looked at her, startled. June lifted a warning finger. "I am not helping you. I am helping him get whatever ending lets him sleep." The next morning, Ethan left the bakery in a white scarf and Mason's old gray sweatshirt under his coat. Mason saw it from across the street and nearly folded in half from the tenderness of it. He waited until Ethan reached the clinic steps before speaking. "Ethan." Ethan stopped so completely the world seemed to stop with him. Slowly he turned. His face went pale, then blank, then painfully calm. Mason stood 10 feet away with empty hands visible at his sides. "I am not here to bring you back," he said, voice rough. "I am not here to ask for forgiveness." Ethan's fingers curled over his stomach. "Then why are you here?" Mason looked at the place where Ethan's hand rested, then back at his eyes. "Because I found out too late, and I need to know where you want me to stand." Ethan looked at Mason for a long time, and the rain filled the silence between them with 1,000 tiny sounds. 3 months ago, that face had been home. 3 months ago, Ethan would have crossed 10 feet of sidewalk just to smooth the wet hair from Mason's forehead and tell him he looked miserable in weather that refused to respect expensive coats. Now he stayed where he was, one hand over the small curve beneath his scarf and coat, heart beating too fast for someone trying so hard to look calm. "You found out," Ethan said quietly. Mason nodded once. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying exactly, but from not sleeping enough and finally learning that control could not hold a person together. "I found the clinic letter. Then the receipt for the socks." Ethan's mouth trembled before he could stop it. The socks. Such a small betrayal, that his hope had left a paper trail. Mason swallowed. "I am sorry." Ethan laughed once, soft and broken around the edges. "People always say that when the damage has already learned their address." "I know. Do you?" Ethan asked, and this time there was no softness hiding the hurt. Do you know I sat in that bathroom with our baby's first picture in my pocket while you told your mother children were a life sentence? Do you know I packed a suitcase while you took a business call because somehow even leaving you had to be quiet enough not to interrupt your schedule? Mason flinched, but he did not defend himself. That mattered. Not enough, but it mattered. I know I made you feel alone, he said. I know I made you think protecting the baby meant disappearing from me. Ethan looked away toward the clinic doors. I did not disappear to punish you. I disappeared because I believed you. The words landed harder than anger ever could. Mason lowered his gaze. Then believe me now when I say I was wrong. Not confused. Not misunderstood. Wrong. Ethan's eyes burned, and he hated that his body still recognized Mason's voice as something safe when his memory knew better. I am not ready to come back. I am not asking you to. I am not ready to forgive you. I am not asking for that either. Then what do you want? Mason looked smaller somehow, standing there in the rain with empty hands and no armor except honesty, which fit him badly and beautifully. I want to show up where you allow me, he said. Appointments. Groceries. Crib instructions I will absolutely be terrible at. Sitting in the waiting room if that is all you can give me. I want to learn without making you teach me twice. Ethan stared at him until the clinic nurse opened the door and called his name. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Ethan turned toward the entrance, stopped, and spoke without looking back. You can sit in the waiting room. Mason closed his eyes like the sentence had reached into his chest and restarted something. Thank you. Inside, the clinic smelled like hand sanitizer, paper forms, and warm air from an old heater working too hard. Mason sat 2 chairs away because Ethan chose the distance and Mason respected it. When the nurse asked whether Ethan wanted him in the room for the heartbeat check, Ethan hesitated so long Mason prepared himself for no. Then Ethan said, he can stand by the door. So Mason stood by the door. He did not move closer. He barely breathed. The nurse pressed the small monitor gently against Ethan's stomach, and for a moment there was only static. Then a fast, tiny rhythm filled the room. Strong. Steady. Impossible. Mason's hand rose to his mouth, and all the cold, polished parts of him broke silently. Ethan watched him from the exam table, eyes wet, expression guarded but no longer empty. That sound is not a promise, Ethan said softly. Mason nodded, tears slipping down his face without permission. I know. It is a responsibility. Weeks later, the people of Silver Harbor got used to seeing Mason Whitaker in places no one expected him to belong. Holding paper bags of ginger crackers. Reading parenting books at the bakery counter with a highlighter. Assembling a white crib in June's spare room while Ethan sat nearby eating toast and pretending not to smile when he put one rail on upside down. Ethan did not forgive him all at once. Love did not return like a storm. It came back carefully, in appointments kept, tea made correctly, space honored, and quiet mornings when Mason asked before touching his hand. And one night, when rain softened the bakery windows and the half-built nursery glowed under a small lamp, the baby kicked hard enough for Ethan to gasp. Mason froze across the room. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then held out his hand. Mason crossed the room slowly, terrified of doing one more thing wrong, and placed his palm where Ethan guided it. The baby kicked again. Mason laughed under his breath, shaking and tearful, as if joy had startled him. Ethan did not say everything was fixed. He did not have to lie for the moment to be beautiful. He only covered Mason's hand with his own and whispered, "This is where you can stand for now." And Mason, who had spent his whole life fearing small hearts that needed him, bowed his head over their joined hands and stayed.